Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. Today I will share how to read CT scan of brain, bone window, whole skull study. Mandible, inferior alveolar canal, vertebral body, sphenoid process, maxillary bone, mandible, styloid process, odontoid process, maxillary bone, mandible, styloid process, anterior arch C1, odontoid process, heart plate, mandible, anterior arch C1, posterior arch C1, lateral mass of C1, transverse foramen, heart plate, pterygoid plate, mandible, anterior arch C1, posterior arch C1, the dens to C2, transverse foramen, atlas C1, heart plate, right and left maxillary sinus, mandible, pterygoid plate, anterior arch C1, odontoid process, nose, nasal septum, heart plate, maxillary sinus, mandible, anterior arch C1, odontoid process, nasal septum, turbinate, maxillary sinus, maxillary bone, pterygoid plate, mandible, occipital condyle, styloid process, nasal septum, turbinate, maxillary sinus, medial and lateral pterygoid plate, nasopharynx, mandible, occipital condyle, nasal septum, inferior turbinate, maxillary sinus, medial and lateral pterygoid plate, nasopharynx, mandible, mastoid process, foramen magnum, nasal septum, inferior turbinate, nasopharynx, maxillary sinus, medial and lateral pterygoid plate, mandible, mastoid process, occipitomastoid suture, foramen magnum, nasal septum, frontal process of maxillary bone, maxillary sinus, pterygoid plate, nasopharynx, hypoglossal canal, foramen magnum, mastoid process, occipital bone, occipitomastoid suture, nasal septum, maxillary sinus, frontal process of maxillary bone, pterygoid plate, clivus, jugular foramen, mastoid process, occipital bone, occipitomastoid suture, nasal septum, frontal process of maxillary bone, pterygoid plate, clivus, carotid canal, jugular foramen, mastoid process, occipital bone, occipitomastoid suture, nasal septum, frontal process of maxillary bone, zygomatic arch, mandibular condyle, spheno-squamosal suture, carotid canal, jugular foramen, mastoid process, occipital bone, occipitomastoid suture, clivus, nasal septum, middle turbinate, nasolacrimal duct, frontal process of maxillary bone, pterygoid plate, foramen of Basileus, foramen oval, foramen spinatum, foramen lacerum, carotid canal, clivus, mastoid tear cell, mastoid process, occipital bone, occipitomastoid suture, nasal septum, frontal process of maxillary bone, nasal bone, middle turbinate, nasolacrimal duct, nasal septum, middle turbinate, nasolacrimal duct, frontal process of maxillary bone, maxillary sinus, internal carotid canal, external auditory canal, mastoid ear cell, groove for the sigmoid sinus, mastoid process, occipital bone, occipitomastoid suture, clivus, Bedian canal, nasal septum, frontal process of maxillary bone, nasal bone, nasomaxillary suture, nasolacrimal duct, maxillary sinus, clivus, internal carotid artery or canal, external auditory canal, mastoid ear cell, groove for sigmoid sinus, occipital bone, occipitomastoid suture, nasal septum, middle turbinate, nasolacrimal duct, frontal process of maxillary bone, pterygoplatin fossa, parotid or Bedian canal, internal carotid artery, external auditory canal, mastoid ear cell, groove for sigmoid sinus, occipital bone, occipitomastoid suture, nasal bone, frontal process of maxillary bone, nasal septum, inferior orbital fissure, greater wings of sphenoid bone, cochlea, sigmoid sinus, mastoid ear cell, occipitomastoid suture, occipital bone, carotid canal, petrous apex, nasal septum, nasal bone, frontal process of maxillary bone, inferior orbital fissure, zygomatic bone, greater wings of sphenoid bone, foramen rotundum, carotid canal, mastoid ear cell, internal auditory canal, left ear lobe, malleus, incus, occipitomastoid suture, occipital bone, nasal septum, zygomatic bone, greater wings of sphenoid bone, internal carotid artery, petrous apex, internal auditory canal, mastoid ear cell, occipital bone, occipitomastoid suture, lateral semicircular canal, nasal septum, zygomatic bone, greater wings of sphenoid bone, spheno-squamosal suture, squamous part of temporal bone, mastoid ear cell, internal auditory canal, occipitomastoid suture, occipital bone, petrous portion of the temporal bone, petrous apex, greater wings of sphenoid bone, squamous part of temporal bone, spheno-squamosal suture, occipital bone, occipitomastoid suture, mastoid ear cell, ethmoid sinus, sphenoid sinus, greater wings of sphenoid bone, spheno-squamosal suture, squamous part of temporal bone, mastoid ear cell, mastoid process of temporal bone, occipitomastoid suture, occipital bone, greater wings of sphenoid bone, zygomatic bone, squamous part of temporal bone, mastoid ear cell, occipito-mastoid suture, occipital bone, superior orbital fissure, medial rectus muscle, lateral rectus muscle, mastoid ear cell, occipito-mastoid suture, occipital bone, greater wings of sphenoid bone, spheno-squamosal suture, squamous part of temporal bone, superior orbital fissure, medial rectus muscle, lateral rectus muscle, greater wings of sphenoid bone, spheno-squamosal suture, squamous part of temporal bone, mastoid ear cell, mastoid process of temporal bone, occipito-mastoid suture, occipital bone, superior orbital fissure, optic nerve, medial rectus muscle, lateral rectus muscle, greater wings of sphenoid bone, spheno-squamosal suture, occipito-mastoid suture, occipital bone, squamous part of temporal bone, optic nerve, lateral rectus muscle, greater wings of sphenoid bone, superior orbital fissure, optic canal, dorsum sella, anterior clinoid process, occipito-mastoid suture, occipital bone, optic canal, superior orbital fissure, optic nerve, medial rectus muscle, lateral rectus muscle, greater wings of sphenoid bone, Kystagelli, anterior clinoid process, posterior clinoid process, occipito-mastoid suture, occipital bone, Kystagelli, greater wings of sphenoid bone, spheno-squamosal suture, squamous part of temporal bone, anterior clinoid process, optic canal, posterior clinoid process, occipital bone, occipito-mastoid suture, frontal sinus, greater wings of sphenoid bone, temporal bone, occipital bone, frontal sinus, lambdoid suture, occipital bone, frontal bone, coronal suture, parietal bone, lambdoid suture, occipital bone, frontal bone, coronal suture, parietal bone, lambdoid suture, occipital bone, frontal bone, coronal suture, parietal bone, lambdoid suture, occipital bone, frontal bone, coronal suture, parietal bone, lambdoid suture, frontal bone, coronal suture, parietal bone, sagittal suture, frontal bone, coronal suture, parietal bone, sagittal suture, frontal bone, coronal suture, parietal bone, sagittal suture, coronal suture, frontal bone, parietal bone, sagittal suture, coronal suture, frontal bone, sagittal suture, right and left parietal bone. If you want, you can hit the subscribe button to get new video updates. Thank you. Allah.